like, and make sure to engage in comments. Also, share this video to your friends and story lovers, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifex for more real horror stories like this. It had been a long, exhausting day at the high school. Principal Robert Hale locked up his office, rubbing the tension from his temples as he made his way to the parking lot. He was tired, his mind cluttered with endless meetings, disciplinary reports, and budget concerns. His only focus now was getting home, pouring a drink, and shutting off his brain for the night. The school was mostly empty by this time, save for a few lingering students and janitors finishing up. The sky had that deep orange glow, the sun melting into the horizon as he stepped out onto the quiet street. He exhaled, relieved to finally be free of work. But then something caught his eye just across the road. A group of boys, 4, maybe 5 of them, were circled around another kid near an alleyway by the side of the school. They were laughing, shoving, throwing punches. At first, he barely registered it. Fights happened all the time. But then, as he got closer, he saw the kid in the middle. Small, skinny, and struggling. A black kid. He recognized him. Devin something. A quiet sophomore, kept to himself. The other kids? All white, wearing Letterman jackets, his own students. Robert hesitated. It was a split-second decision, one he would regret for the rest of his life. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He wasn't on duty anymore. These things worked themselves out. Besides, if he stepped in now, it would become a whole situation. Calls to parents, paperwork, maybe even backlash from the school board. It was just easier to walk away. So, he did. He walked straight to his car, got in, and drove home. That night, he barely thought about it. Watched TV, had a drink, went to bed. Life moved on, until it didn't. The next morning, whispers spread through the school like wildfire. A student was in the hospital. Devin. The injuries were bad. Internal bleeding, broken ribs. He had been found unconscious near the school, and no one knew exactly how long he'd been lying there. A teacher had heard rumors and called an ambulance. Robert sat in his office, staring at his desk. His stomach churned, a heavy guilt pressing down on him. He knew. He had seen it, and he had done nothing. But what was he supposed to do now? Come forward? Admit that he saw it and walked away? That would destroy his reputation, his career. He told himself there was no proof he had been there. No one saw him. Maybe it was better to just stay quiet. Days passed. Then, the worst news came. Devin didn't make it. He died from his injuries, alone in that hospital bed. 16 years old, gone. The school held an assembly, offering thoughts and prayers, a memorial fund set up in his name. Robert stood on stage, giving a speech about bullying, about kindness, about how Devin would never be forgotten. But inside, he felt like a fraud, because he had forgotten him when it mattered most. After the funeral, that's when things started to change. It began with small things, a feeling like someone was watching him, a shadow in the corner of his office when no one else was there. At night, He would wake up to strange noises, footsteps creaking in the hall, the faint sound of whispering just beyond his bedroom door. And then, one night, something happened that made his blood run cold. Robert was alone in his office, working late. The building was quiet, the janitors long gone. He reached for his coffee, but as he lifted the cup to his lips, the overhead lights flickered. Then, the room went completely dark. A chill swept over him, a sudden drop in temperature that made his breath visible in the air. His heart pounded as he reached for his phone, fumbling for the flashlight. And that's when he saw it. In the reflection of his office window, standing right behind him. A boy, thin, hollow-eyed, his skin pale, his expression blank. Devin. Robert spun around, but there was no one there. His office door slammed shut on its own. His breath hitched, panic rising in his chest. He staggered backward, his mind scrambling for an explanation. He had been working too much. Stress. That was all this was, stress. But then the whisper came. A voice, soft, hoarse. You left me. His stomach dropped. The lights flickered back on. The office was empty. But he knew deep down that he wasn't alone anymore. Robert barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that reflection. Devin standing behind him, his face blank, his eyes dark and lifeless. The whisper echoed in his mind. You left me. By morning, he convinced himself it had been a hallucination. Stress, guilt, his conscience playing tricks on him. He told himself that, but deep down, something felt off. At school, things only got stranger. The students whispered about weird things happening in the hallways. Classroom doors slamming shut on their own. Lockers rattling. The janitor swore he heard someone crying in the boys' bathroom late at night. But when he checked, it was empty. And then there was Devin's old locker. At first, nothing seemed unusual about it, until Monday morning. Robert walked past it on his way to his office, and that's when he noticed it. The lock, which had been removed after Devin's death, was back on. Brand new, shiny, but that wasn't possible. No one was assigned to that locker anymore. It was supposed to be empty. He stopped, staring at it, his heart pounding. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. And then, bang! The locker door shook violently, as if someone was trapped inside, slamming their fists against it. Robert stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. Students turned, staring at him. But when they looked at the locker, nothing. It was still, silent. One of the teachers frowned. You okay, sir? Robert forced a nod, his pulse hammering. Yeah, I must be seeing things. But he wasn't, and it was only going to get worse. That night, as he lay in bed, his body heavy with exhaustion, a sound made his eyes snap open. A faint tap, tap, tap at his bedroom window. His heart clenched. He lived on the second floor. Slowly, he turned his head toward the window, dread creeping up his spine. The curtains were drawn, but the tapping continued. Then something dragged across the glass. A slow, agonizing screech, like fingernails scraping against it. His hands gripped the sheets. His mouth went dry. And then, a shadow moved behind the curtain. Robert bolted upright, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He wanted to move, to run, but his body wouldn't listen. He was frozen, trapped in place by a fear he couldn't explain. The shadow lingered, tall, motionless, watching. And then, as if it knew he was looking, the curtain shifted. Just slightly, just enough. And he saw it. A face, pale, hollow. Devon. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. And then, "You left me." Robert's body snapped into motion. He lunged out of bed, ripped the curtain open. But there was nothing. Just the night. Just the empty yard below. His stomach twisted. He wasn't safe. Not at school. Not at home. Not anywhere. And then he heard something behind him. Drip, drip, drip. Slow, steady. A wet, rhythmic sound coming from the hallway. His entire body went rigid. He didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see, but something made him. And when he did, his breath caught in his throat. A trail of dark, wet footprints led from his front door, all the way to his bedroom. The last footprint stopped right behind him. Robert didn't move. He couldn't. His breath was shallow, his entire body locked in place as his eyes followed the dark, wet footprints that led straight to his bedroom. The last one, right behind him. A cold breath rolled down his neck. Then, a voice right at his ear. "You left me." Robert spun around, his heart nearly bursting out of his chest, but there was nothing, no one. The room was dead silent except for the steady drip, 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 echoing from the hallway. His eyes flicked to the floor. The footprints, they weren't just wet, they were red. Blood. Something was here. Something had walked through his house, had stood behind him, breathing down his neck. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking. He had to get out. He had to. Bang. His bedroom door slammed shut on its own. Robert's breath hitched. He rushed forward, gripping the handle, locked. His own damn door locked him in. And then, from the other side of the door, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, dragging, moving closer. Then, a knock. Soft at first, then harder and harder until it was pounding. Robert stepped back, his pulse hammering. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, a whisper, so close it might as well have been inside his skull. "Open the door, Mr. Hale." Robert squeezed his eyes shut. This wasn't real. This wasn't real. And then, the door unlocked by itself. The handle turned, slowly. The door creaked open, inch by inch. The hallway beyond was dark, but Robert knew. He knew something was standing there, watching, waiting. Then, from the darkness, footsteps rushing toward him. Robert screamed, stumbling back, tripping over his own feet. He hit the floor hard, his head slamming against the nightstand. His vision blurred, stars dancing in his eyes. Then, silence. He panted, his chest rising and falling, ears ringing. Slowly, he turned his head toward the doorway. It was open now, wide open, but the hallway was empty. Robert sat up, his body trembling. That's when he saw something on the floor near the door. something that wasn't there before. A single sheet of paper. Cautiously, he reached for it. The paper was old, yellowed, the edges slightly burnt, and on it, in smeared black ink, was a list of names. He scanned it, his brow furrowing. Dozens of names, all scratched out, except one, his own, Robert Hale. A chill ran down his spine. His hands shook as he flipped the paper over. On the back, written in deep red letters, "You are not the first." His stomach dropped. A creak came from behind him. His breath caught. Slowly, he turned his head and saw Devin standing right there. Only this time, Devin wasn't alone. Behind him, stretching into the darkness, were dozens of shadowy figures, hollow-eyed, motionless, all of them staring at Robert. The last thing he heard before the room plunged into darkness. "Now, it's your turn." Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to Mortifex for more real and true stories like this.